Our speaker today is going to talk about making the case for optimism. As we know, life has its ups and downs, and a series of adverse events can lead one into pessimistic mindset and depression. And modern psychology has developed simple tools to respond to adverse events to keep one from falling into depression and become increasingly resilient. Today, Bill Farmer is going to share his story of recovery from depression and what he has learned about using optimism as a crucial tool for weathering adverse events. Bill has followed his interests throughout his life and career, which has led to a non-lineal existence. Among his various experiences are studying for the priesthood, being a naval reservist, becoming a conscious objector, a decade spent as an actor and improv comedian, returning to college as an adult, working as a research engineer in Japan, serving as a high-technology corporate executive, working as a corporate consultant, and teaching as a university professor. He's done a lot. Bill is also a recovering pessimist and is here today to tell us how he now values optimism as a core ingredient of his personal well-being. Please welcome Bill Farmer. Thank you, Bill.
So I am here today to talk about optimism and psychology and mental health. Let me start by asking, how many people here consider themselves optimists? I love it. I'm going to be preaching to the choir. So today I'm going to talk about the evolution of positive psychology, and I'm going to weave in a negative part of my own personal story today. So let me ask this. How many of you have ever woken up somewhere completely disoriented, confused, you look around and you wonder, how in the name of dear God did I end up here? And I'm not going to ask you to share because those stories can be particularly embarrassing, and mine is, but it was so long ago I feel comfortable sharing it. I'll just ask you to please hold judgment. So it was a Saturday morning in July in 1980, and I woke up in South Minneapolis, walking along the service road to 35W. I had partied at a house about a half a mile away the night before, and apparently I'd gotten up, walked a half a mile, and walking a half a mile got enough blood to my brain to bring me to consciousness. It was a hard time in my life. I was a pessimist, and I was depressed. And when I woke up, I wasn't particularly happy to be awake because my head hurt, my eyes were bleary, and my throat was parched. But it was what it was, and so I looked around uncertain and had to make a plan for what to do. And we'll return to the story forthwith. If I had gone to a psychologist and gone in for treatment at that time, I would have been treated with what's called classical psychology. Classical psychology is what they use to treat people who were in depression. The route into depression was really well known. You were a pessimist to start with, so you were vulnerable to depression. You would have some adverse event, something negative would happen into your life, it would knock you off balance, and you would start thinking about it, ruminating on it, working it over and over and over again in your brain, think PTSD, and this would create a downward spiral that would carry you into depression. Once you were into a depressive state, you were much more vulnerable to additional adverse events. And so more adverse events would happen, you would continue to spin and eventually slip into the trough of despair and depression. There was a treatment, and the treatment was a drug treatment. And it was successful. The idea was to bring people who were dysfunctional and bring them back up to functionality. And the drug treatment successfully did that, except it left them feeling hollow. It left them feeling empty inside, as if they had no personal agency, no control over their own lives. And as we now move forward and explore psychology and mental health, I want to talk about binary pairs. You know that we know things by comparing two opposites. They stand in opposition to each other. And there are two binary pairs that I want to talk about today. The first one is virtue versus vice. They're mirror images of each other. Vice, we take upfront benefit and then pay for it over the long term. Think of my drug and alcohol use back in the time when I woke up walking along the service road. The drug and alcohol killed the pain and quieted the voices in my head, but I paid a price for it over the long term, both physical and mental health. Its mirror image is the virtuous cycle, where you pay up front and then you experience the benefit long term. Most of us put a moral overlay over virtue and think that I'm going to pay the price in this life and be a good human being and enjoy a positive eternal life. But also, to bring it back to the earthly plane, think of a company that invests in a new product. They pay the money up front, and then the product comes to market, they start selling it, and get the long-term benefit of both increased sales and increased profitability. These two curves each have a name. The vice curve is called the addiction cycle, and the virtue curve is called the investment cycle. I want to isolate virtue and talk about it in terms of optimism. There are three great virtues: faith, hope, and charity. And to make my point, I want to rearrange them, and I want to change some of the words we use. Again, these words have moralistic meanings, and I want to, again, bring us back to earth. And so I'm going to put hope first and change the others to faith to belief and charity to generosity. And I contend that optimism is based upon a virtuous cycle I call the optimism cycle. We start by embracing hope, and embracing hope is the most challenging part of the optimistic cycle because you have no reason to believe that you're going to be successful in whatever your pursuit is. You invest just in the possibility that you can reach your happy ending. And so hope is like planting a seed. And as you go, hope is active. You need to nurture the seed. You need to attend to it to make progress towards your intended target. Over time, you start getting feedback. You start seeing things that convert your hope into belief. And you think, now things are working well. There is a really good chance you believe you will reach your eventual target. And then as you continue to invest, the belief re-energizes you, refreshes you, you continue to invest, and eventually you get to your eventual target. And when you reach your target, you're filled with this feeling of achievement, you feel accomplishment, and you start sharing both the spiritual benefit of achievement and also, in some cases, the physical overflow of your achievement. And this is the optimism cycle. I'll be referring to this later on, but it's a cycle that involves all three of the great virtues. The other binary pair I want to talk about to set the groundwork for the talk, is pessimism versus optimism. When we look at binary pairs, we tend to think of them often as black and white. You're an optimist or you're a pessimist, but in reality it's a spectrum. And all of us have some mix of optimistic bias and pessimistic bias that places us somewhere on the spectrum. The pessimists at the extreme end of the spectrum and the optimists at the other extreme end say of each other that they distort reality, that they're removed from reality. But the truth is that everybody on this spectrum is tethered to reality. So to understand that, I'm going to put a fulcrum here at the bottom, and I want to talk about human beings. I want to go back 30,000 years to when our ancestors lived in caves. Genetically, we're the same human beings that humans were 30,000 years ago. We have the same mental capabilities and the same physical capabilities. But 30,000 years ago, humans were dealing with a different set of problems than we deal with today. One of the big problems was food insecurity. But the people who had a taste for and were attracted to sweets, salts, and fats had a better chance of survival, living long enough to procreate, and pass that genetic code down to us. Now here in our cushier times, the result of those biases is tooth decay, high blood pressure, and an obesity epidemic. Likewise, survival was a key issue for them. We were not then apex predators. And so people who were more finely attuned to danger survived. So if you were able to more sensitively pick up negative signals, your chances of surviving and passing on your genetic code was higher. In fact, it's measured now that we are 4 times more biased towards the negative than towards the positive. We don't need this gift any longer because we're not dealing with the same survival threats. But just like our peripheral vision, it was passed down and handed to us. And what this does is it takes us and it biases this spectrum towards the negative. Think of it, if this were gravity, that we're at risk of sliding down what I call the optimism spectrum from an optimistic standpoint towards a pessimistic standpoint. So now if we take this inclined plane and we add it into what we had seen as the trough of despair, we get a more complex and a fuller picture of the human experience. In the 1990s, at the end of the 20th century, this optimism spectrum became a point of interest for psychologists. There was a young researcher at the University of Pennsylvania whose interest was seeing if he could use optimism as a way of pulling people who were just mildly depressed, like I was at the time, out of depression, and people who were functional, but at the vulnerable pessimistic end of the spectrum, pull them from functional up to thriving. My story, when I was talking about the day I woke up, I was probably around here. I was probably in the area of increasing helplessness. I felt like I had hit rock bottom, but really I was on a steep part of the slope and vulnerable to falling deeper and deeper into depression. So let's return to my story. So I woke up walking along the service road to 35W, and it was a particularly hard time in my life. I was a pessimist to start with, and I had experienced over the course of the previous year a series of adverse events, events that negatively impacted me. First one was the death of my father. And so, ruminating on it, working on it, I sort of carried myself down the spectrum closer to depression, and then I got divorced. And so again, this downward spiral accelerated and carried me down further, and soon thereafter my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so it was a really, really hard time for me in my life, and I heard voices in my head, and I quieted those voices with drugs and alcohol. I was depressed, and so as I came to and realized where I was, I remembered that there was a convenience store about 2 blocks away, and I was completely parched, completely dehydrated from parties the night before. And so I made a plan. I was going to walk to the convenience store, buy some water, walk across 2 blocks, hop a bus, and take the bus the 1.5 miles I had to get home. I was very frugal in those days. I was in my late 20s, but still working as a busboy in a Mexican restaurant. I was making $60 a week. If you annualize that and project it into today's money, I had an annual salary of, in today's money, $10,000. So the decision to spend money on water and to take the bus, those were big decisions for me, but it felt, the way I was at that period in time, that particular day, it felt like money well spent. I went to the convenience store and I went to buy the water. I was shocked that my wallet was empty. I had no money, and I knew I had started the night with $15 because that was my take-home pay from the day before. And I immediately thought that when I had fallen asleep at the party, somebody had rolled me and stolen my $15, and I was incensed. I learned later that that wasn't the fact at all, that I had in fact fallen asleep at the party. I had gotten up in the middle of the night, rejoined the party, purchased drugs, danced like a crazy man for 2 hours, and then fell asleep again in the comfy chair in the corner of the party room. But there I was, no money, so no water, no money, no bus ride, and so quite unhappily, I started the 1.5 mile trek home. So let's return back to this optimism spectrum. And I put on here a dotted line, and this dotted line represents, I call it the reality axis. Okay? And that everybody, like I expect everybody in the room who's a functional human being, exists on this optimism spectrum, this part of the spectrum. And regardless of what you may think of people who are at the other end of the spectrum from you, you're all tethered, living lives tethered to reality. Positive psychology wanted to study this part of the spectrum, and they had 3 major hurdles to overcome. First, it was a brand new field of psychology, and so there was no historical data. There were no shoulders of giants to stand on. There was nothing to research. If they wanted to do research into optimism and its role in psychology, they had to create the data that they could analyze. To do that, they needed first a way of diagnosing people, placing them at some place on this spectrum. And the second, or the final hurdle that they had to overcome was once they were able to put somebody and place them on this optimism spectrum, they had to be able to look at their reaction to events that would move them up or slide them down the spectrum, and then figure out both the correlation to where they were on the spectrum and the role of psychology, the role of optimism in the psychology of it. So the first challenge that they overcame was a diagnostic tool. They borrowed the diagnostic tool from another field of psychology called attribution theory, and this tool is called explanatory style. Explanatory style is how you explain the causes of an adverse event. So if you're a pessimist, if you're an extreme pessimist and something bad happens to you, you think of the cause as being permanent. You think of it as affecting your entire, all of your circumstances, and you think of yourself as the agent, as the cause, the locus of the cause of the adverse event. If you are an extreme optimist, you think of the cause as being just a point in time, just affecting some particular situation of your life, and that the primary drivers of the adverse event were external to yourself. And so with this tool, positive psychologists now had a way of doing interviews and being able to place people at an appropriate point on the spectrum. It's called their dispositional mindset. As researchers did these interviews and moved forward in studying optimism, they realized that this explanatory style was not just a diagnostic tool, it was in fact the cause of the disease, and flipping it on its head, it could be the cure. So explanatory style was how people talked externally about causes of adverse events. But when they took that and turned it internally and talked about the causes of adverse events, it became like we talked about in depressive psychology. It created this rumination that created a downward spiral. And if you took explanatory style, a negative explanatory style, and started talking to yourself, doing self-talk with that, it caused a downward spiral, and you slid down. You slid down the spectrum. On the flip side, if you took a positive explanatory style and used that to talk to yourself, it had 2 values. It could arrest the slide down the spectrum And at the end of the optimist spectrum is the cliff that carries you into pessimism. And it also could be used to create an optimistic cycle that carried you up the spectrum to a safer spot, more distant from the cliff that would carry you into depression. And here, I suspect most of you have read these while I've been talking, but these are an example of explanatory styles. Self-talk, a pessimistic person, child has a fight with the child, they run out and slam the door, and you say, I'm always yelling at my kids, permanent, I'm no good at anything global, and I can't handle, I'm not strong enough, it's all about me. An optimistic style, last Sunday I didn't go to church, specific point in time. I'm not good at driving in the snow, a specific context. My husband wouldn't drive me either, an external cause. And so if you use the pessimistic style, you can drive yourself into depression. If you use an optimistic style, you can elevate yourself. But there still was that significant problem that there was no data to analyze. So they could do the interviews, they could create data, and they could start to do analysis, but progress was extremely slow. Until one day, a researcher was reading the newspaper about, it was the Monday sports section. He was reading about the football game, his city's the home team's football game the day before, and they had lost. And the field goal kicker had missed a field goal in the closing seconds that could have won the game. And in the article, the field goal kicker was interviewed and he said, yeah, the wind was against me yesterday. And the researcher immediately said, oh, just sort of, out of knowledge of the field, he said, oh yeah, external causes, optimistic mindset. And then he had the aha moment that if you had a verbatim record of something that somebody said, you could then use it to plot their position, their dispositional mindset along the spectrum. And so a field that had no data whatsoever suddenly realized that they had data that went back until records, the beginning of recorded history. Every newspaper article, every magazine article, diaries, journals, letters, people, where we watch TV, people used to write letters. Anytime that you could get access to somebody's verbatim statements about adverse events, you'd be able to plot them on this optimist spectrum. And if you had lots of data about them, you could track their progress up and down the spectrum according to their explanatory style to adverse events. There's a whole series here of research that was done. This access to data opened up the doors, and lots of people came in now to study positive psychology and the role of optimism in mental health. I'll just pick one of these. I'll take the top one, presidential elections. They took the first 22 elections of the 20th century, and they plotted each of the candidates along the optimism spectrum. And it turns out that in these 22 elections, 18 of them were won by the person with the more optimistic explanatory style. And so to be able to actually pull meaning out of it, they had to be able to dismiss the 4 outliers. 3 of those 4 were the re-elections of FDR. And they were able to dismiss those, saying between progress being made during the Depression and then World War II, people were reluctant to change horses in the middle of the stream. So they were able to dismiss and account for 3 of them. And so only 1 outlier remained, and that outlier was the election of Richard Nixon versus Hubert Humphrey. And we all know Hubert Humphrey was an extraordinarily optimistic man, and Richard Nixon certainly was not. And so they really needed to come up with a way of explaining that. And they did some research, and it was easy. That the electorate punished the Democrats because for the previous 12 years, the Democrats, the Democratic presidential administrations had lied to the American people about the Vietnam War. And so optimistic style is not the only factor in determining success. Here, there were significant other factors that led to the results. But through all of these studies, there was a consistency that said an optimistic mindset, an optimistic explanatory style, optimism doesn't guarantee success, but it biases you towards success. It increases the likelihood of success. So during the last Olympics, by the way, if I go back a second, this technique is called CAVE. It's content analysis of verbatim explanations. And I saw this headline during the Winter Olympics, and the word optimism caught my eye. And so I read it, and I thought this would be interesting to apply the CAVE style to Jessie Diggins. Now, you probably all remember Jessie Diggins in the very first race, her first race in the recent Olympics. She fell, severely injured herself. She was one of the favorites to win the race. Even though she was injured, she continued to race through pain, and finished 8th off the podium. And this interview she gave was immediately after she concluded the race. So she was still in pain from her injury, and she was, feeling the disappointment of not having won a medal. And she said things like, "It just didn't work out for me today," point in time. "Oh, there's so many races to go," confined context, specific context. "There's so many variables that need to come together to have a good race," external causes. And so, I don't know if you can see, this picture is actually her at the end of the race, and you can see she's kind of goofy. This interview, scored on a CAVE scale, was a perfect score for optimism. And so if I'm here today trying to make the case for optimism, with help from Jessie Diggins, I'll rest my case. Optimism, as the research has found out, does not guarantee you success, but biases you towards success, because Jessie Diggins, in her second race, as she said, the doctors told her she couldn't do any additional damage by racing, but she'd be in intense pain. She said she raced through the cave of pain and ended up winning a bronze medal in her next race. So as we get towards the end of this talk, what I want to do first is say, complete the spectrum. Just like there is a deviation from the axis of reality at the depressive end, there is also deviation on the optimistic end, but instead of descending into it, you arise, you elevate into it. If depression is the field of classic psychology and optimism is the field of positive psychology, this new part of psychology here is the realm of flow psychology. Flow psychology was developed at the University of Chicago, and it talks about a state, a temporary state that we can go into. There are five requirements to get into the flow state. You have to have clear goals. You have to be able to make measurable progress towards those goals. The goal has to be a challenge. It has to be outside your comfort zone, but in spite of the challenge, you believe you can attain it, and you need long periods of time to make progress towards your goal. And when you enter this flow state, all distractions, doubts, they all disappear, they melt away. Your mind and your body merge together, they work in perfect harmony, and you are completely absorbed by whatever your focus is. And you may think that you've worked, that you've been involved in this, what you've been working on for 15 or 20 minutes, and you look up and you're shocked to find out you've been working on it for 6 hours. It's a temporary state in which we can leave reality and enter a higher level state. And then if you continue up the spectrum, you get into the realm of myths and mysticism. And so you meet your whirling dervishes and your indigenous shaman with hallucinogenic experiences, your hermits, your yogis, your gurus sitting at the mountaintop. But perhaps the most accessible individual up here towards its peak is St. Francis of Assisi. Torn cassock, rope for a belt, barefoot, living in a cave, a life of pure bliss and rapture. And so the human experience, this represents now the full human experience, and life can be dysfunctional, a life of hell. It can be rapture, a life, practically a life in heaven, but most of us live on the bracketed optimistic cycle, somewhere with some mixture of optimism and pessimism. With life's continuing ups and downs, good events and bad events, moving up and down according to how we deal with our self-explanatory style. There's about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to put off questions to the end. I'm going to jump to concluding my story, my conversion to optimism. So I got off the bus and I walked home. And I was renting a single room in the second floor of a home. I didn't have access to kitchen privileges, so I went up to the second floor, and the bathroom was empty. There were 2 other people who rented rooms in this house. The bathroom was empty. I went in. I drank about 3 glasses of water to rehydrate. I freshened up a bit. I went to into my room, lay down on my bed, stared at the ceiling. It's a position I had assumed a lot in those days, and just stared and wished for divine intervention or a sign, some way of getting from the life I was living to the life I could only imagine. And as my mind started to wander, I realized, oh, I was supposed to meet people that afternoon, and so I got up and I went to the phone, landline, and called a friend and said, I'm not going to be able to make it. And when I hung up the phone, I just mindlessly picked up a Newsweek magazine, the latest article. I had an aunt who gave me a subscription to Newsweek every year as a Christmas present. And I was just leafing through it, and an article caught my eye. It was an article about a fellow whose life closely resembled mine. And so I was drawn into it. The fellow was a Mexican-American who lived in California. He had been in the Marine Corps and had been drummed out of the Marine Corps with a dishonorable discharge. And it started a perpetual downward spiral that took him through humiliation after humiliation, and he ended up living on the street for several years. And somehow, he summoned the courage and the energy to embrace hope and to try to find a way out of the trough. And he went back to school, and he thought maybe education is a way out of despair. And the basis of the article was that at that point in time, he was graduating at the top of his class from Harvard Law. And I thought, that's it. I was a pretty good student. Maybe education is my way out of the hole. And so, a year later, I was enrolled as an engineering student in the University of Minnesota. 5 years later, I had, and the hope part of the optimism cycle is the most difficult part, because you have no feedback. You're only operating on a possibility, and so you're constantly being challenged. You're constantly being tempted to give up. But 5 years later, I had gathered enough signs, there were enough clues that it was a good path for me, that I moved from hope to belief. 10 years after my day of optimism, I got a master's degree from MIT. And still, it was 14 years before, another 14 years before I really reached the generosity conclusion of the optimism cycle. It took that long for me to get rid of all of the emotional detritus that had kept me in the well. And so I now live the life I could only imagine, when I was lying on that bed. And the thing that changed it all for me, of course, was optimism, embracing hope. And I learned early about the explanatory style, and I've used it continuously to try to reinforce my position. We all who live on the optimistic spectrum, our life has ups and downs. We're all going to face adverse events. And if you find yourself sliding down the spectrum because of adverse events, learn to use the optimistic explanatory style to break the slide and carry yourself up to a safer position. And the thing is, when you're sliding down, it's not a good time to learn. So listen to how you talk to yourself when you encounter the negative, and learn to convert however you talk to yourself into a positive explanatory style. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I'll open it up for questions. I'll also, a couple of things. I will stay here as long as anybody wants to talk about this. I've got cards at the reception table in the back of the room that have some information about explanatory style so that you can take it with you and hopefully learn to do it well, and also a picture of the spectrum. And also my contact information is on the card. So if you get home and you look at the cards and you have a question or want to chat about it, absolutely feel free about contacting me. Yes?
I'm struck, as you mentioned Francis of Assisi, because the Franciscan delivering the homily at the church service I went to yesterday, who views Italy as his holy land, was, even though it does go back 30,000 years or even to the dawn of Christianity, he spoke of a church in Italy. And the church, which of course the medieval churches had their art, the pictures were supposed to help the illiterate understand the scriptures and stuff. And on one side it had the 7 vices, and the lowest of the vices was despair. And on the other side, despite the Beatles, all you need is love, that the last one, the highest virtue was hope.
Yeah, thank you, yeah. Interesting, St. Francis of Assisi died 800 years ago, and his relics, his bones, were just put on display. And I think they were on display for like 2 weeks, and 250,000 people made pilgrimage to pay him respect.
I have one.
Yes.
I was taking you pretty literally when you were talking about verbatim statements.
Right.
And I assume those could be statements to yourself or to the public.
Right.
What about if those statements are a lie?
Well, yeah, if you're talking to yourself, they're a lie, right? Although there is, we're not instinctively 100% honest with ourselves, right? But what we talked about here was, if you will, statements that held truth. But I see your point, Mike, which is if you're reading something from a politician and it turns out to be a lie. I think the antidote to that is that over the course, lies are hard to sustain, and that if you have a record that progresses over time for, if you will, mapping somebody else onto the spectrum, then that will come out. And when you're talking to yourself, the point of this is the danger of falling into pessimism. And when you're into depression, and when you're a pessimist, you look on reality and not to hope, and you berate yourself, and you tend at that point not to lie to yourself, but to say what you really believe about your position. But it's a really interesting question. Yes.
Very interesting talk. I have a personal interest in it. I have a foster child that we came to live with us when he was 2 years old, fetal alcohol syndrome. He actually experienced childhood trauma. He watched somebody stabbed to death. To this day, he's a troubled child.
Yeah.
Troubled
Now,
adult.
what? Sorry?
Troubled adult.
Troubled adult.
Yes,
Yes, he's in his 30s. Okay. The one thing that I'm wondering about in your talk is that the attributing things to external factors is something that he's got that mastered. Right?
Yes,
It's never his fault. It's never his responsibility.
That's right.
And is that? I'm wondering if that's really helpful. Like, it seems to me that's not helpful.
Yeah, it depends upon how you look at it. So if he's in danger of falling into depression, it is helpful because it keeps him from blaming himself. If he's on the edge, it keeps him from blaming himself and falling off the cliff. There's one other thing here. We're talking here about the psychology of people who can, if you will, be on the optimism spectrum. When we talk about depression, for instance, there's 3 kinds of depression, and 2 of them are appropriate for what I've talked about today. But manic depressives is not a mental disease, it's tied to a physical disease. So psychology alone can't handle it. And so it sounds like your son, part of what his problem is is tied to a physical, the fetal alcohol syndrome. And so this kind of self-management is really not appropriate if your problem is partially rooted in physicality.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, hang on to your questions. Bill will hang out for a few minutes.
There you go.
But I want to get you out on time. Thank you so much, Bill. Appreciate you sharing what you've learned.